If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Have you ever contemplated the deeper psychological forces behind Cain murdering his own brother over a religious offering? What drove the Tower of Babel builders to think they could reach heaven through human effort? Why Esau would sell his spiritual inheritance for a bowl of soup? Why these patterns seem to repeat endlessly through history, and why they're still operating in your consciousness today? In our first episode, we discovered how New Testament figures reveal eternal psychological patterns. Today we trace these same forces to their origins in the Old Testament, and uncover why transformation seems almost impossible without specific spiritual development that most churches no longer teach. Consider this: you make the same mistakes repeatedly despite knowing better. You choose immediate gratification over long-term spiritual growth. You trust institutional authorities more than your own biblical discernment. That's why you ask the internet for the interpretation of a story before pondering your own thoughts regarding it. The Old Testament personalities aren't ancient history. They're showing you the foundational patterns that still govern human consciousness. Today we explore how these ancient accounts function as precise psychological documentation, revealing why certain spiritual forces seem almost impossible to overcome, and what the early biblical figures discovered about developing the consciousness that can actually transform them. Most people read the Old Testament as either historical narrative or moral instruction. Both approaches alone miss what's hidden in plain sight. These ancient accounts document the first appearance of psychological forces that continue operating in every human soul. When we examine the actual language and behavior patterns, we discover something remarkable. The same consciousness dynamics that drove Cain's murderous jealousy, Nimrod's institutional control, and Esau's spiritual carelessness are the foundation for the patterns we explored in the New Testament. The Old Testament shows us where these forces entered human consciousness historically. The New Testament shows us how they operate in developed form. But here's what's crucial: both testaments assume that human beings possess spiritual faculties capable of recognizing and transforming these patterns. Modern churches have systematically eliminated the spiritual development methods that would enable this transformation, leaving people trapped in cycles they can observe but not overcome. Today we'll explore how the Old Testament functions as foundational psychology, showing the origins of the patterns that still control your thinking and revealing what kind of consciousness development the biblical authors assumed was possible. And as a quick aside, don't forget to like and subscribe as we continue these studies into the consciousness of being. Let's start with Cain, the first documented case of what spiritual science calls Ahrimanic consciousness entering human thinking. For those just joining us, Ahriman, according to Rudolf Steiner, is the spiritual being often identified with the biblical Satan, distinct from Lucifer. Where Lucifer pulls us into emotional fantasy and pride, Ahriman chains us to cold materialism. He's the force that whispers there's nothing beyond the physical world, that keeps you scrolling your phone for dopamine hits instead of conscious participation in life, that makes you calculate your worth by comparing possessions with others and reduces relationships to transactions. He's the calculating intelligence that acknowledges only what can be measured, weighed, and controlled in the physical world. Or you can find it perfectly presented in the coined phrase, "You only live once." Here's the scene, Genesis 4:3-4. And in process of time it came to pass, that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. The fundamental psychological difference reveals itself in their intentions. Cain calculates the value of his offering by his own effort. I worked hard to grow this, therefore it's valuable. But here's the deception. The fruit grew through God's nature, not Cain's labor. He merely assisted a divine process, yet in his mind, his effort made it worth more than Abel's offering. Abel offers firstlings of his flock, living beings he received as divine gifts, already imbued with the breath of life. He recognizes himself as a steward, not a creator, offering back to God the finest of what God first gave. Abel understands that blood and life force belong to the divine realm. He can only receive and faithfully return them. Cain measures spiritual worth through material calculation and personal effort. Abel practices receptive stewardship, knowing that true spiritual value flows from divine source, not human achievement. Genesis 4:5, and Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. Genesis 4:6-7, And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted, and if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over it. Cain's immediate response is wrath. His countenance falls because his calculated investment didn't yield the expected return. This is the first historical appearance of what we'll later see perfected in Judas, the Ahrimanic pattern of measuring spiritual relationships through material calculation. God offers Cain direct spiritual instruction. The divine voice explicitly tells him he has the power to rule over the sin crouching at his door, the very Ahrimanic force influencing his thinking. The tragedy is that Cain's consciousness is so convinced his effort should determine spiritual value that he can't receive the guidance. Once Ahrimanic calculation takes hold, it blocks the very spiritual perception that could transform it. Genesis 4:8. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him. The Ahrimanic pattern completes itself. When material calculation can't achieve spiritual results, it eliminates the spiritual consciousness that threatens its dominance. Abel's very existence proves that spiritual value doesn't come from human effort, so Cain removes the living contradiction to his worldview. And when God asks, Where is your brother? Cain's response, Am I my brother's keeper? Reveals the final Ahrimanic triumph. Complete egoistic separation, denying any spiritual connection or responsibility for another soul. We live Cain's question daily, Am I my brother's keeper? When communities ask for volunteers and you think someone else will do it. When you could correct someone's harmful mistake but stay silent to avoid conflict. When you witness injustice but calculate it's safer or more comfortable to say nothing. When you have knowledge that could help but withhold it because they didn't ask nicely enough. This is Ahrimanic egoism, calculating that spiritual connection ends where personal inconvenience begins. This is Cain's pattern operating through your consciousness, the same force that would later speak through Judas, through Pilate's political realism, through institutional Christianity's material focus. Now let's examine Nimrod, the first systematic attempt to replace spiritual authority with human institutional control. Genesis 10:8-9. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. You can see the precise moment human consciousness began seeking divine status in the line, he began to be a mighty one. Notice, he wasn't made mighty by God, wasn't born mighty. He began to be mighty through his own will. We have now consciously transferred the mightiness of God onto an individual person. The phrase mighty one in the earth directly parallels how Scripture describes God as mighty one of Israel. And before the Lord doesn't mean serving God, but rather standing in front of, in God's presence, Nimrod establishing himself as mighty while God watches. This is the first appearance of individual ego asserting itself against the divine, humanity's free will choosing institutional power over spiritual development. The tribal consciousness that once moved as one with divine will now fractures into individual personalities claiming divine authority for themselves. Genesis 11:4. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Listen to what they're actually saying. Let us make us a name. Not let God make our name, but we'll create our own identity, our own significance. This is humanity's first corporate brand, the first institutional identity that replaces individual relationship with the divine. And why? Lest we be scattered, fear of individual spiritual responsibility. They're literally saying, if we separate, we'll have to face God individually, so let's create a collective structure that keeps us safely grouped together. The tower reaching to heaven isn't about getting to God, it's about bringing heaven down to their control. This is the birth of every religious institution that says, you need us to reach God, creating collective dependency to prevent the terrifying freedom of individual spiritual development. Genesis 11:6. Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Genesis 11:7-8. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. God's response reveals something Steiner called a premature spiritual attempt. Humanity trying to storm heaven using only human personality before that personality had matured enough for the task. Nothing will be restrained from them. This is praise to what we are capable of achieving, but at this time, it was a warning. When collective human will tries to reach divine heights through institutional force rather than individual spiritual development, it creates dangerous spiritual distortion. The confusion of tongues wasn't punishment, it was protection. Steiner taught that humanity needed to pass through separation, through the development of individual consciousness, before we could consciously reunite at a higher spiritual level. The scattering forced what they feared, individual souls developing their own relationship with the divine. But this was necessary. The original unity had to break so that each soul could develop the spiritual maturity to eventually choose conscious reunion with the divine, rather than hiding an unconscious collective identity. Every denomination today speaking past each other, every religious institution that can't communicate genuine spiritual truth, that's Babel's protection still operating, preventing premature institutional control over consciousness that isn't ready for true spiritual unity. That's the Babel pattern, institutional authority speaking religious words that have lost all spiritual meaning. And when the Church officially removed spirit from human nature at the Council of Constantinople in 869 AD, they perfected Babel's confusion, creating institutions that use Christ's words while denying the very spiritual capacity Christ came to awaken. Now let's examine Esau, the perfect example of Luciferic consciousness, abandoning spiritual development for immediate material satisfaction. Genesis 25:29-30. And Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Watch Esau stumble in from the field, completely overwhelmed by physical exhaustion. He was faint, not just tired, but so consumed by bodily need that all spiritual awareness vanishes. This is every one of us when we're exhausted, hungry, stressed. Suddenly that spiritual practice we committed to seems impossible compared to just collapsing on the couch. Genesis 25:31-32. And Jacob said, Sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, Behold, I am at the point to death. What profit shall this birthright do to me? Listen to that question. What profit shall this birthright do to me? He literally can't see spiritual value when his stomach is empty. The birthright, the spiritual inheritance, the connection to Abraham's covenant with God, becomes meaningless words when physical need screams louder. Steiner taught that Esau represented ancient instinctual consciousness that had to be cast aside, the part of us that operates purely from immediate physical impulse, unable to perceive anything beyond the present moment's demands. This is the Luciferic pattern we saw with Peter, immediate emotional response overriding spiritual understanding. But Esau's case is more serious. He permanently trades spiritual authority for temporary material relief. Genesis 25:33-34. And Jacob said, Swear to me this day, and he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. The most unnerving part is what happens next. He did eat and drink, and rose up, and went his way. No regret, no second thoughts, he fills his belly and moves on. Thus Esau despised his birthright. This wasn't a moment of weakness, but his fundamental worldview. He represents what Steiner called consciousness, stuck at an earlier evolutionary stage. The ancient clairvoyant faculties were dying in humanity, but Esau couldn't develop the new conscious spiritual capacities that were meant to replace them. Unable to perceive beyond immediate physical reality, he chose the only world he could still feel, the material one. Hebrews 12:16, Lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. The New Testament calls him profane, meaning devoted to that which is not sacred, unable to distinguish sacred from secular. This is the eternal pattern, consciousness so trapped in immediate physical reality that spiritual inheritance seems like fantasy. You live this pattern whenever exhaustion makes you skip prayer/meditation for sleep. When financial pressure makes you abandon spiritual practice for overtime work, when you promise yourself you'll return to spiritual development when life calms down, as if physical life ever stops demanding. When you trade eternal development for temporary comfort, telling yourself the birthright will still be there tomorrow. That's Esau speaking through you, the ancient instinctual consciousness that can only perceive what the body demands right now, unable to see that some trades can never be reversed. But here's what's hopeful. Jacob shows us how Luciferic patterns can be transformed through sustained spiritual effort. Genesis 32:24. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. Jacob faces his spiritual test completely alone. No priest, no institution, no mediator. Just individual consciousness meeting spiritual reality directly. And the duration, until the breaking of the day, emphasized this wasn't a momentary prayer or quick meditation. This was a laborious endeavor required to reunite individual consciousness with divine reality, the very capacity needed for Christ to eventually work through human beings, not above them. Genesis 32:26. And the angel said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. This is the opposite of Esau's quick surrender. Jacob's body is exhausted. He's been wrestling all night. The angel said, Let me go, but Jacob refuses to quit without transformation. This is Luciferic will properly directed. The same force that creates stubborn pride when misdirected becomes unshakable spiritual determination when properly focused. Genesis 32:28. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. The name change isn't symbolic. Steiner taught that biblical name changes represent actual spiritual rebirth at the level of the I. Jacob the manipulator becomes Israel, one who can wrestle with divine reality while maintaining earthly effectiveness. Power with God and with men is the balanced consciousness we desperately need. Neither escaping into spiritual fantasy nor drowning in material existence, but maintaining genuine spiritual connection while serving effectively in the world. This transformation of Luciferic forces from selfish manipulation to spiritual determination shows what's possible when emotional and willful energies are properly trained rather than suppressed or indulged. The same stubborn will that made Jacob scheme for the birthright becomes the force that won't let go of the angel until blessed. When was the last time you wrestled with a spiritual challenge until an actual breakthrough occurred? Not just until you got tired. When did you maintain spiritual practice through the whole dark night, not just the comfortable evening? When did you refuse to let go of a spiritual question until you received real transformation, not just intellectual answers? Jacob shows this patient, sustained effort is how consciousness actually develops, but it requires exactly what modern Christianity has eliminated: the understanding that individual spiritual development through consistent daily practice can transform the very forces that otherwise destroy us. Now let's see the ultimate Old Testament example, Moses, whose consciousness was developed enough to receive direct divine communication. Exodus 3:14. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. When Moses hears, I am that I am, he's experiencing what Steiner called the cosmic spirit manifesting in the innermost center of human consciousness, the ego itself. This isn't God speaking to Moses from outside. This is divinity awakening in the Holy of Holies within human awareness. The same I am that would later speak through Christ saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, first revealing itself to the one human consciousness prepared to receive it. Exodus 33:11. And the Lord spake unto Moses face to face as a man speaketh unto his friend. Listen to the beauty of that line. Face to face as a man speaketh unto his friend. No symbols, no intermediaries, no institutional interpretation needed. Moses possessed something extraordinary. He was the last human to retain ancient clairvoyant faculties, while simultaneously developing the new intellectual consciousness we use today. He could perceive spiritual reality directly and understand it rationally. A bridge between two worlds of human consciousness. Numbers 12:6-8. And he said, Hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I the Lord will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak unto him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all mine house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches, and the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. God explicitly states Moses operates differently than other prophets. While others receive symbolic dreams requiring interpretation, Moses gets direct transmission, mouth to mouth, even apparently. The burning bush wasn't a vision or metaphor. It was Moses' consciousness actually perceiving spiritual reality through developed faculties. This is what every human being was meant to develop: direct spiritual perception without institutional mediation. Deuteronomy 34:10. And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Why didn't this level continue? Because Moses represented humanity's transition point, from ancient group consciousness where the tribe moved as one, to individual ego consciousness, where each soul must choose its relationship with the divine. The methods that developed Moses' dual consciousness, both clairvoyant and intellectual, were gradually abandoned as humanity moved fully into intellectual consciousness alone. By 869 AD, the Church made it official. Humans don't possess spiritual faculties, only body and soul. They eliminated the very capacity Moses demonstrated. What would it mean today to develop Moses' level of consciousness? Not waiting for dramatic visions or supernatural signs, but developing the spiritual perception to receive direct guidance, knowing with absolute clarity when divine truth speaks through your innermost being. The ability to distinguish between genuine spiritual instruction and your own emotional impulses, between divine guidance and institutional manipulation. Moses shows what we're meant to become: individual consciousness so developed it can receive divine communication directly, exactly what Christ assumed possible when commanding us to prove all things and try the spirits. But this requires the systematic spiritual development that Moses underwent in Egyptian mysteries, that early Christians practiced in their communities, and that institutional Christianity systematically eliminated to maintain control. Now you can see the complete psychological foundation: Cain's materialistic calculation, Nimrod's institutional control, Esau's spiritual carelessness, Jacob's transformation through sustained effort, Moses' direct divine communication. These aren't just ancient stories, they're the operating system of human consciousness. And here's the tragedy: the very methods that enabled Jacob's wrestling and Moses' face-to-face communion have been systematically eliminated from Christianity. The 869 AD Council didn't just remove spirit from human nature, it made biblical commands like prove all things and try the spirits seem impossible. How can you test spirits if you have no spiritual faculties? Reformed theology perfected this trap by declaring individual spiritual initiative either impossible, total depravity, or dangerous, pride and division. So, modern churches perpetuate Nimrod's system. All spiritual authority flows through institutional channels, while the individual spiritual development that would fulfill Christ's commands remains forbidden. You're told to have personal relationship with God while being denied the consciousness development that makes it possible. This is why you recognize these patterns but can't transform them. You see Cain's calculation in yourself, feel Esau's pull toward immediate gratification, experience Babel's institutional confusion. But the spiritual exercises that transformed Jacob, the consciousness training that prepared Moses, the systematic development early Christians practiced, eliminated, replaced with just have faith, while the methods that develop faith into direct knowing remain hidden. The result? Millions trapped in patterns they can observe but not overcome, told that transformation is either unnecessary, you're saved by faith alone, or impossible, only biblical figures could do that. The perfect formula for permanent spiritual dependency. The early Christian communities understood something crucial. Christ's incarnation made it possible for every human being to develop the consciousness that Moses achieved: direct spiritual communication without institutional mediation. This is why the New Testament overflows with commands for individual spiritual discernment. Prove all things, try the spirits, search the scriptures daily whether these things are so. These aren't suggestions for intellectual study, but practical commands that assume developed spiritual faculties capable of direct spiritual perception. These methods survived in esoteric Christian tradition and were rediscovered through the spiritual scientific work of Rudolf Steiner and others, who recognized that Christ's incarnation opened the possibility to restore the consciousness capacities that institutional Christianity had systematically eliminated. The consciousness that allowed Jacob to wrestle with angels, that enabled Moses to speak with God face to face, that gave early Christians the spiritual discernment to fulfill Christ's commands. This isn't reserved for special biblical figures. These are spiritual capacities that can be systematically developed through specific practices that restore the biblical spiritual faculties. Modern Christianity claims are either impossible or unnecessary. You can review these ancient patterns in your daily life. The Cain pattern, that mental spreadsheet tracking what everyone owes back to you. The prayer that feels betrayed when God doesn't deliver on schedule. The spiritual practice you quit because it didn't produce measurable results. The Babel pattern, accepting interpretations because authorities teach them, not because you've verified them spiritually. Feeling safer in programs than developing personal discernment, needing pastoral approval before trusting what the Spirit shows you directly. The Esau pattern, I'll pray when life calms down. Choosing overtime over spiritual practice, trading eternal development for this month's bills. But you've also glimpsed the transformation. Jacob moments, when you wrestled with a spiritual question until breakthrough came, not just until you got tired. Moses moments, when inner guidance was so clear you couldn't doubt it, when scripture suddenly became living truth, not just ancient text. These glimpses prove the consciousness development biblical authors assumed is still accessible, but accessing it consistently requires the systematic spiritual training institutional Christianity eliminated. The Old Testament reveals these psychological patterns have operated for millennia, yet so has the possibility of transforming them through specific consciousness development. The forces that drove Cain's murderous calculation drive your materialistic thinking today. Nimrod's institutional control operates through every church that blocks individual spiritual authority. Esau's carelessness speaks when you trade spiritual development for immediate comfort. Yet Jacob's transformation remains possible. Moses' direct communication represents achievable human development. Early Christianity preserved the methods that enable these capacities. The moment you truly recognize these patterns operating, really see them as they happen, you begin developing the spiritual perception that can transform them. Which Old Testament personality dominates your consciousness? Start there. Watch that pattern for 1 week without judgment. Notice when it activates, what triggers it, how it operates. This simple recognition practice initiates the consciousness development that makes transformation possible. Once you see these forces clearly, you discover something remarkable. They're not your true self. You have more power to choose differently than you realized. But recognition alone isn't enough. The biblical authors assumed systematic spiritual development would enable complete transformation. Methods that restore the consciousness capacities institutional Christianity eliminated. The consciousness that wrestled with angels, that spoke with God face to face, that enabled early Christians to fulfill Christ's commands. This development remains possible through specific practices modern spiritual science has recovered. In the coming weeks, we're releasing a comprehensive course showing exactly how to develop these biblical consciousness capacities. Not theory, but practical methods for fulfilling the scripture commands we've explored. If you're tired of recognizing patterns you can't transform, ready to move beyond institutional dependency into genuine biblical spiritual authority, this course provides the systematic training institutional Christianity eliminated. Join our email list for launch notification and preparatory materials over the next 3 weeks. The open door that no man can shut isn't just a promise, it's practical reality when you develop the consciousness to walk through it. Thank you for joining us in this exploration. Until next time, keep watching those patterns, because recognition is where transformation begins.